like to invite Samantha Slater, manager at Welch LLP, to say a few words as the sponsor for the evening. Samantha?
Thanks, Colin. I'm Samantha Slater, manager at Welch LLP, and Welch is very excited to be sponsoring the event tonight. For those that you don't know us, Welch is an accounting firm. We do audit, assurance, tax, and consulting services. And I appreciate everyone's attendance tonight because it's a struggle these days to feel a sense of community. And I'm happy to see that the Ottawa U alumni community is still going strong. Anyways, thanks for having me, and I hope everyone enjoys tonight's event.
Great. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks for joining us, and thanks again for Welch's support, both for this event and for Telfer and a lot of the student activities at Telfer.
Absolutely.
So with that, I'd like to pass it off to the two moderators tonight, both of whom are members of the Telfer Toronto Alumni Network and the Executive Council. So Aziz Garuba, BCom 08, is Director of Cost Transformations at RBC, and he's VP of Partnerships for the TTAC. And Ellen Dalicandro is BCom 13 and lawyer and Assistant Director and Talent Management at Stikeman, Elliott. So Aziz and Ellen, please join me on the stage here. Great. So with that, I'll pass it off to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Colin. Hi, everyone. Great to see you here with us tonight, albeit virtually. Just a quick note about what the Toronto Telfer Alumni Network is all about. And we can't really tell you about TTAN, which is our acronym, without telling you a little bit about the council. So the council was formally established in May of last year by a group of Toronto alumni, including Aziz and myself, who were interested in gaining a sense of community within the alumni who are working and living here in the GTA, and to also provide support for students that are interested in transitioning to Toronto after they graduate. And the TTAN is a larger group of thousands of members, and probably including individuals like yourself who are here tonight, who attend our events and are a part of the greater community. So we have a bunch of ongoing initiatives that we organize and we're a part of. It includes community engagement, it includes webinars and events such as this one, as well as mentorship. And our current members, as I mentioned, Aziz, myself, we also have Alex Detman, Nick Detmer, Chris Weatherhead, Aryan Habib, and Tanvir Mustafa, many of whom are here tonight. And hopefully you'll get a chance to meet them in either one of the breakout sessions or in the one-on-one networking. You can find TTAN on LinkedIn. We also have a Facebook page. We can add you to our mailing list, and we often advertise our events in the Telfer Alumni newsletter. So lots of ways to check us out. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Aziz to introduce our guest speaker and a good friend of ours, Brennan Lowe.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this great looking virtual event. It's a shame that we couldn't be at the real top of the tower, but we're going to make it as interesting as possible, even though we're just on your screens. So today we're just going to have a quick conversation with our interesting speaker or guest this evening, Brennan Lowe. So Brennan currently works as a director of international growth at Shopify, and he joined the company in early 2011 when it was less than 50 employees. So, when it was really small, as a business development advocate. And now in his current role, he's responsible for Shopify's global expansion efforts. And he spent time living in both Bangalore and Berlin, helping establish Shopify's physical presence in those regions. So Brennan graduated from the Telfer School of Management in 2012 with a BCom in marketing. And as a student, he spent 4 years on the executive team of the Entrepreneurs Club, including 2 years as club president. And today, Brennan is based in Ottawa, where he remains active in the entrepreneurial community as both a mentor and an investor. So it is my pleasure to bring up Brennan to the stage. So first couple of a first note. So an interesting fact about Brennan. So I've known Brennan since literally the day he showed up on Telfer, on the Telfer campus, and I was in the Entrepreneurs Club at that time as well. And the amazing thing was that Brennan signed up to be a member of the Entrepreneurs Club applied for I think it was an assistant position before he even became a student at Telfer. That was how eager he was to be a part of the school and a part of the entrepreneurship world and stuff we were doing at the time. So I don't know if he remembers that, but that stuck with me for pretty much since that time. And I think that was back in like 2007, September of 2007. So on that note, Brennan, what was your, just talk to us about your Telfer experience. Like, what was it like? What are some of the memorable moments that you had at the school?
It's funny that has to be, I remember that day vividly because it was I think it was September, and school kind of had just started. And I remember being like, what do I wear? Like, I remember like looking on the online, found this website of this club, was like, they host big dinners or galas for professionals. Sounds pretty cool. Sounds like something I want to be involved with. And just, learn before I started really learning. And anyway, I think I wore like the fanciest thing in my wardrobe, which was like a golf t-shirt at the time. That went to explain a lot of how I approached the formal dress code at Telfer over the years. But I think there's so many good memories. At Telfer, I mean, so many people. It's funny, on this call, were a part of a lot of the fun times and development times I had at the school. I got to say that for me, it was, I kind of felt like high school was this really, really small box by the end of it. And one of the things I was so eager to do when I got to university was just sink my teeth into like as much of the real world or emulated real world interactions I could. And so I think some of the fondest memories for me were outside of the classroom. Like I remember maybe like 2381, like presentations class as being the class that Koppel, and some of the great TAs would scare the crap out of you. And that was something that probably sticks with you. I don't know if it's like a form of PTSD or like a good memory, but like it's somewhere in between. But I honestly think a lot of the experiences that I relish were those that came from the student groups that we were part of, the opportunities to kind of play real world, as you were still a student. And whether it was sort of organizing the events like Ellen Business Dinner at the Entrepreneurs Club, or it was being able to go out and like fundraise money for a club, like ask professionals to hand you checks of thousands of dollars and then subsequently spend those thousands of dollars. That was a very like empowering feeling as a student. And then later on, running a startup and figuring out in the corners of the university at the time, so call it 2010, like what was available for, a punk like me and a couple of his friends that wanted to start a business, like what resources were there? The elevator pitch competition from the Entrepreneurs Club was one thing, but there was like the startup garage at the time was an engineering only project out of the engineering faculty, that was trying to give money or give you space. And so I think for me, it was a lot of just this experimentation of a bridge between a confined academic environment and then, a little bit of a soft landing into the real world.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. And of course that experience led you to kind of where you are right now, which we'll get to in terms of your Shopify journey a little bit later. But I guess the next question, why did you even choose commerce as a program coming into university?
I think commerce itself was fascinating to me. Like I can't downplay the fact that my dad being, a businessman, what was a big impact on me growing up is trying to figure out what it was that he did. And, what is this business life? I think that early on, I remember just being so enamored with the idea of making money. Like it was just fascinating to me, the power of money early on, as a kid, that motivated me to start a lot of businesses. I mean, I didn't think of it as starting businesses or starting entrepreneurs, just like, let me try this thing and see if it gives me money, as like a validation that it was a good thing to be trying or good thing to be doing. I mean, I remember when I was in middle school, which probably like God bless my parents, because what they witnessed with me as a middle schooler must have been so troubling from one perspective, but from the other, you have to kind of like applaud initiative. So you're kind of like, from a parenting perspective, like, do I like scold or do I encourage? Like, maybe I'll just not say anything. And I remember going on like Kijiji and trying to find people that were selling things at a low price that I could buy and resell on eBay. Like, I would go to garage sales at like 3 p.m. and try and figure out like what people didn't sell, and then like pitch them on consignment that I could sell it on eBay and take like 25% of it.
Wow.
And I had like a wagon, I'm like, put stuff in the back of the wagon, I'll put it on eBay. And that I think eventually morphed into something like at high school, going on eBay and trying to find like, what are things that I can buy in bulk and then sell to, people in high school. And I remember having like one of those pieces of paper with like the tearaway slips at the bottom, and I called like MP3 for you. And I found like the supplier of MP3 players. They were awful, but like before iPods, that like I could sell for $40 to people at school. So commerce to me was just this like inevitable like end, or so means to an end. And at the end, I wasn't totally sure. I think it was money at the time, but it was just a way for me to experiment. And I think as time went on, unfortunately, it's not a great story. Like, I wouldn't put this as testimony on the Telfer website, but like, I wanted to stay in Ottawa. They were giving me some scholarship money. I was like, cool, I get to live at home. Some of my friends are going here. I picked Telfer over Sprott because we had just opened this beautiful new Desmarais building. There was a lot of brand new furniture and some like really flashy stuff. And I said, well, that sounds like the perfect place for me. So I, that was sort of what led me to Telfer. But man, it really felt like it was in my blood.
Nice. Ellen, do you have any questions for Brennan yet?
Did you say if I have any questions?
Yeah.
Sure. Of course I do. Okay, Brennan, hit you with a tough one here. So what advice would you give to your younger self?
I think that there's a couple ways that I look at this. Knowing what I know now, one of the things that I was very intimidated with when I was sort of in the like fourth year and moving into the real world was this like perception of being really good at everything. If I've done some coaching actually through Shopify, which is a fantastic experience. If you ever get the opportunity to do professional coaching, it's a really, really great opportunity. And one of the things that they teach you in coaching, at least the coach that I was working with, was this concept of Enneagrams. And Enneagrams, kind of like Myers-Briggs, is, a great tool to get to know yourself a bit better. And one of the things that really helped me with as a mental model to get to know what my default was what kind of Enneagram I was. And I was a type 3, which is an achiever. And, as it insinuates, an achiever is really focused on what's the end goal. Like, what am I going to do to get there? How do I get there? And how do I get there yesterday? Those are the things that were always going through my mind. And I think that as I stepped into the real world, and I think back to where my head was at, the idea of being a constant learner is something that is super, super important. Like, the real world changes so fast, as we all know. And I don't think that resting on my formal education was something that I could have depended on to navigate a lot of the challenges that I did. That's different. I mean, I'm not a lawyer or an accountant or someone who has to go through and really learn a specific craft very, very deeply. But I think there was this idea that as an achiever, like, the best thing I can do is almost fake it till I make it, right? Like, just pretend like I have all of these skills that I don't have, or be confident in any situation. And where I've really eaten the most humble pie in my career has been where I've just been okay accepting that I'm not really good at something, or I'm not smart at something yet, or I'm not skilled at something. And that was just a very important mindset to be able to embrace, to learn a lot of things, but then also get better at the things I wanted to get better at. So being a constant learner was certainly one. I think the other one is it's really important to balance learning, as I kind of just talked on, with doing. And in the when I work with some of my teams, I laugh when we talk about sort of new business ideas or initiatives that we want to launch. And I love when people kind of come with this like whiteboard and this like perfectly drawn out business model. And I kind of call it like an MBA solution. And, you know, no offense to those that have MBAs, but like, it's this like perfect, beautifully well understood business model on paper. And all it takes is like, you know, a little bit of poking around. Will that work in the real world? Like, how do you actually do that?
Right.
And I think that there's so much learning that just comes from doing, and so much of my own experience that I've gathered to just come from trying stuff and failing and just learning off of the back of that. So I think that's what has made me gravitate to so many of the entrepreneurial outlets, both at the school and then outside of the school, is because I just really get along with people that are like really comfortable and really have a lot of fun talking about all the times they mess things up. Like, it's like, you know, you want to like compare scar tissue, you know, you're like, remember the time where we did this and that was stupid, you know, like I really, really gravitate to that kind of conversation. And so that's something, again, that sort of just, you know, people can kind of wait for the timing to be right or the things to be right. There's never going to be good timing. Like, you just have to go and do it to then understand if it's something that makes sense, continue to pursue. So those are sort of two things I would certainly lean into my older or my former self.
Right. No, that's good. And let's touch on your Shopify journey. I mean, you joined the company in its infancy, right? You know, less than 50 people. First of all, how did you end up there? And you know, let's talk about your journey throughout the organization up until this point.
Yeah, it's a fun story to think back on, because I mean, I was looking at it recently. I've been at the company for almost a decade, you know, by the end of this year, which is insane because it feels like many lifetimes. How I actually ended up bumping into Shopify in the first place was really that idea of, I attribute it to kind of like making your own luck. You know, it actually came from the Entrepreneurs Club, believe it or not. So in third year, there was this course, I forget what it was called, but it was a pretty well-known course, which was it was like an entrepreneurship course that melded students from Telfer and then engineering students.
I remember that course.
And it was taught by Bruce Firestone at the time. Yep. And so as a result of that class, I got paired up with these two, you know, super smart engineers, like really the first engineers I'd ever met. It was kind of like, ooh, like, you know, what are you, you know? And software engineers too, right? So like even odder breeds of people, as I've come to realize throughout my career. And we started this business, and we were working out of their apartment off of Elgin Street. And it was in the middle of summer, or it was approaching summer. And we kind of asked ourselves, it was summer of third year, we were going to go into fourth year. We all knew we were going to go back to fourth year, but we kind of said like, we kind of looked at each other and said, well, if we go get part-time jobs or full-time jobs over the summer, their earning potential was maybe 10K for the summer. Mine was like, you know, 6.5K, you know, as a business student. And we sort of said, okay, well, that's the opportunity cost. Why don't we just try and run this business and see if we can make it into something over the summer? And if we don't, we all have a plan B, which is we go back to fourth year and that's it. And so we were working out of their apartment because they were roommates. And it was by chance that we were in the Byward Market one day getting lunch, and it was super, super hot, and their place didn't have AC. And some of you might remember him on this call. Aurelian Lethic was a member of the Entrepreneurs Club, and he was working at Shopify at the time. And he said, hey, we just raised Series A money. We just got this brand new place over top of Tucker's Marketplace in the market. We have a whole bunch of empty tables and chairs. If you guys want to come use them, you're welcome to. And we were like, you know, is there coffee and beer? They're like, yes. We're like, okay, fine. So we're going to come run our startup. So we ended up working out of the Shopify offices in 2010. And like, none of us cared about Shopify. Like, we had no interest in the business of Shopify. We were like, we're running our startup. We're going to crush it. Like, thanks for the free lunch, guys. But like, we're on our own. We're going to make $1 billion company. And then when we had to go back to school in September, we were faced with this question of like, do we keep running this business, or do we, or do we just shut it down? And Shopify was basically going on a hiring spree, which meant they were going to hire like 8 people. And, at the time, which gives me total confidence that I would never be hired in Shopify today. They were like, well, you guys, showed up at the office on time. You worked really hard. Like, you're asking questions. You're there for 14 hours a day. Do you guys want jobs? And we initially were like, nah, like that's okay. But then we ended up saying, okay, this actually might be kind of cool. And that's how it started.
Wow.
So, it was certainly not this crazy experience of I'm going to interview it like what it is now. Like I said, it's incredibly difficult to get a job there. But I think it just, when you think about the individual events, like these were very intentional events. They weren't intentional events to get to Shopify, but they were very intentional things of like, we're taking the summer off. We're trying this entrepreneurship thing. We're going to take space and we're going to give it all we can. We're going to work 15 hours a day in this free space. Thanks very much, suckers. And then, it kind of led to what it was. And so it really affirms in my mind, like you create your own luck. And that's sort of the journey that got us into Shopify back in the day. And it's been a bit of a different roller coaster throughout, but nonetheless, a really fun story with good roots back to Telfer.
Awesome.
Aziz, tell me about the podcast.
Yeah, so the podcast that I host is called Made to Lead. And I interview a whole bunch of different people from African descent, people of African descent that are doing amazing things in different spaces. So, from a variety of industries. I've interviewed a few executives, a few people that are just starting off their careers, some doctors, some lawyers. But the goal really is just to highlight some of the interesting lessons that they've learned along the way, how they got to where they got to, some of the challenges that they experienced, and things that they would have done better, in their lives, or advice that they'd give to younger people. And the goal really is just to highlight that, some of the talent that comes out of the continent, that's on the continent or in the diaspora, and that can be inspiration to other folks, that want to do interesting things in that space. Or, feel like, oh, I can relate to that story and, there's something that I can do there. So yeah, launched it literally at the start of the pandemic.
That's great.
Which was great. And I had some time off during that period. So it was great to actually work on it. And yeah, it's caught on quite well,
Good for you. That's fantastic.
Yeah, we've done over 10,000 listeners in 6 months, which is apparently very good.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So we're both
fun.
like that. Yeah. And we're in season 2 now. I've interviewed a couple of my friends that have some interesting stories. So a cool one was one of my buddies who I went to high school with back in Nigeria before moving to Canada. And he ended up, doing a bunch of things. He came to Canada to work for a bit with Bain. And then he went to Harvard, did his MBA at Harvard, worked for HP, and then went back to Nigeria to start an airline company, to help an airline company start a logistics company start a charter airline company. So spent 2.5 years building that, to on-time delivery. Turned down Google, turned down Facebook. Like these guys offered him jobs, and he was like, "Nope, I'm going back to build an airline." And then after that, he ended up working for a tech startup called Andela, which you probably may have heard of at some point. And he left Andela at the beginning of the summer to take a sabbatical, but he was the VP for global operations there, and built the company. Grew 400% over the 4 years that he was there.
Cool.
$1 billion valuation now, which is great for an African company, like an African startup.
Yeah.
Minted a whole bunch of interesting tech entrepreneurs or tech talent out of the continent, from Nigeria to Rwanda, Egypt, Uganda as well. So really good stories that you can learn on the podcast.
Nice, awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Do we join somewhere else, or do?
No, I mean anyone. I think someone wants to come on board and say something.
I don't know how this system works, so I'm sort of just.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, Will.
William.
How's it going? I hope I didn't interrupt anything there.
No. We are just.
No, all good. Just chatting.
Yeah.
First off, Aziz, that sounds your podcast definitely sounds really cool. Especially if you're interviewing all these people. Definitely gonna take a listen tonight after this.
Yeah, subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Helps
of course.
us grow.
That's right.
No, for sure. And I have a question for Brennan. So your story with me like really resonated. Like I remember back in middle school kind of a thing, selling dumb little things like whether it's like mints or something like that to kids to just make like a little bit of extra money. And currently I'm like the VP finance for TechDev, so like same as where you were. So like your story really resonated with me, and like your story about being in the Byward market and you got that office space above Tucker's and all that. Really cool. I guess my question is, now that we're kind of just stuck inside, how would you say is like the best way to, like, as you kind of said, build your luck?
Yeah, it's I think about it now and I go back to like, the what was available or what felt available to us at the time. And it wasn't that long ago, right? But it still felt like so much of business pushed you in this in-person direction. And I remember how much emphasis was put on like, go to networking events and like, go to the golf tournaments. And I think the statement of like business is done on the golf course couldn't be less true in today's day and age. And I think that, as an example, like what Aziz is doing with a podcast is such a great sort of modern day example of how you can network and get yourself out there without literally leaving your living room. And I think that it often meant putting yourself out there. I think that was the thing that was interesting for me, which differentiated me from a lot of my peers at the time, was that a lot of my friends from high school, and I went to high school in Ottawa, I went to university in Ottawa. So I had a lot of friends like in the city, and a lot of them didn't go to networking events in the first 3 years of their school. And I was so baffled by that, because I'm like, who gives a shit in like first and second year if you suck at networking? Like it doesn't matter. Like you need networking in like third and fourth year. So you might as well suck at it and practice it. And then like when it does matter, you're good at it. Like that was like the theory in my head. And it was so interesting to me how they left that until like third year, like end of third year, I need a co-op summer placement, or I need to get my fourth year like job. And if you understand how the world works, like the spots are all gone by then. Like you're already too late. And so a big part of that in that time was just putting yourself out there and being like, I'm going to go and meet people. I'm going to go and just stand awkwardly in a room and listen to a keynote speaker in a suit. Like that's just what you did. I think the modern day equivalent of that is there's so many ways to interact with people that are like the ceiling so much higher. Like you could literally follow and have a dialogue with like the CEO of any company you want on Twitter, right? You can like start a thing like a podcast, and you can be like, you know what? I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to invite, 100 people to be guests on my podcast. And even if 10 of them accept, like that's 10 people you get an in-depth conversation for an hour. And you literally like, all you had to do was put yourself out there. And I think that people really undervalue effort. And that's the thing that like is so baffling to me, because it doesn't take a lot to actually differentiate yourself. And I think with everyone in this level playing field of like, no one's at the golf course, no one's at the networking events. Like you don't have to go that much further to be so much different from your peers. So I don't know if it's Aziz or Ellen want to build off of that, but like really, I just look at that and go like, man, what an equalizer this is all being.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So for me, when I started at Telfer, I was, coming off of high school, being, I was a shy kid, still an introvert. But I knew that within, being in a business school, and, most people being type A personalities, and I wasn't that kind of person, I needed to figure out how to differentiate myself from everyone else. So the networking thing was huge. I started that from first year, and second year, I threw myself into things that, were uncomfortable for me, so that, I could actually develop, different ways of dealing with things. So I joined the student clubs, I got onto the student council. I became a frosh guide as well, just so that, it got me comfortable talking to people. Because I knew that in business, right, if you didn't know how to like, if you didn't have the confidence or the ability to communicate with your clients, you were dead in the water. right? So for those, for me and for people like me, that was this kind of stuff that we were doing. And fast forward, I guess 15 years, this is where we are now, right? And to Brennan's point, right? Like just even this podcast that I did, it was a passion project. And it's turned into so much more now. Like I think it was Monday, as a result of someone finding me on LinkedIn through, because of this podcast, I got to facilitate a conversation at Google for their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Week, and they paid me to do this, and I was like, okay. And it was a strange thing. Like I'd never met this person before. She reached out to me on LinkedIn. It's like, hey, we need facilitators. Here's how much we're willing to pay. Here's the budget. I'm like, what? and of course that comes from just, putting yourself out there in a way that, you're stepping out of your comfort zone. It was scary, like putting my voice out into the public, right? And people are going to listen to this, every day or whenever they tune in. That's part of my reputation, part of my brand, and but it's worked out. And you don't, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take, right? But at least if you take one, there is a 50% chance that you might get it. So there's really nothing to lose.
No, for sure. That's definitely a great answer. Yeah, I was just, I'm like going into my 4th year, I'm in co-op, and it's kind of just like, this is not really how I expected 4th year to be. 4th year, but you like you said, you go to all these events and stuff, but like Brennan said, you're now on like a level playing field. So you got to find a way to distinguish yourself in the I guess the business world, and just like kind of like what you did, make a podcast or something like that. And now you have Google reaching out to you and paying you for these, events.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. What are you studying now?
I'm in finance.
In finance, right? Oh yeah. So finance is even one of those more interesting places because it's highly competitive, like super competitive. Yeah. And it requires you to stand out in more ways than one. And more so now where, it's not just your academics, but some of the other skills that you have, some of the technical skills. I mean, and the insight and perspective, like you're part of the Gen Z, demographic, right? So for some companies now, even in finance, it's like, what am I thinking about? Like as a Gen Z person, what are some things that I can bring to the table that an investment manager might look at and they may not be seeing because they belong to a different generation or different demographic. How can I show them that, hey, as part of the quote unquote TikTok generation, there's a business, there are business cases, there are investment theses that can come from that versus the next person that's just maybe going the straight and narrow. So it's just a matter of being creative.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's some really good advice, and I appreciate all the answers. That was definitely very insightful, and definitely got to reflect on that for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much
joining us and being part of this very simple session.
No, it was
he's
great.
Got more mentoring in 5 minutes than he has in a while.
Telling you, man, the effort bar is like pretty damn low when all you got to do is hit the join meeting button.
Yeah. Ask to share your screen audio. That's all you got to click.
Yeah. And for the 14 people that are watching right now, let's see who else has a question that
Aziz, we had a question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
It was actually directed at yourself, and it was, what advice would you give to someone starting out a podcast today?
Okay, cool. So
I'll let someone else join. But thank you for all your answers.
Thanks,
William.
So what I would say to someone that wants to do that, you have to have something that is interesting to talk about. I think as of this year, there are over 1 million podcasts.
Wow.
1 million podcasts. And the market for podcasts is expected to grow massively over the next 2 to 3 years.
Why is that, by the way? Like, if I think of everyone, most smartphones have had a podcast app preloaded. Spotify,
Right.
Apple Music have podcast sections. What has led to the like increased demand for podcast content?
I think it's the I'll start with the what's driven the availability of podcasts, right? One, the barriers to entry are literally next to zero, right? Anyone with some kind of decent audio and a recording device, you can record yourself on a smartphone and you can upload that file into any podcast service. So the bar to entry is really low. So anyone can do this. And then I think also the space within podcasting allows people to be more direct with folks. So that's why this has sort of taken off, right? So you look at, let's say, Joe Rogan has been around since the beginning of podcasting. So he's like the outlier. But then when you look at Joe Budden, right? Joe Budden's a music artist, but he's grown his podcast following hugely. And that's because he has something to say and people want to listen to his authentic stuff. And he does like 3 hours, almost 2.5 hour long sessions, and people are listening to this. So the proliferation of podcasts and people getting into it is because, hey, I want a space where I can actually put out a message that's clear, that might be niche focused, and people are willing to listen to it. I don't have to deal with certain things like algorithms on YouTube for discovery. It's just a matter of whether I how, like for me with my podcast, like I don't do any paid marketing for it. I just share it on LinkedIn and on my Instagram stories and on WhatsApp, and that's it. Some other people do a lot more, but that's just all I have time to do right now. So again, those barriers to entry make it easy for these podcasts to go through. And then, so to the question in terms of thinking about what you need to do if you want to start a podcast, you have to have something to say, right? It's not enough to just say, oh, I just want to speak and hopefully someone listens. And then thinking about longevity. So when I started this podcast, initially, I had thought about it last year, and I wanted to focus on, what it's like to be Black on Bay Street, right? And maybe interview a few Black individuals that are on Bay Street. But I was like, this is going to have a limited run at the time, and the stories would more or less end up being the same, right? Finance, lawyers, like literally just finance, accounting, and lawyers. That's what it would end up being. So I went back to the drawing board, and at the beginning of this year, just really started thinking, okay, what do I like? What am I passionate about? Who am I passionate about hearing? And then I decided, I wanted to focus it on the idea of leadership, and leadership in the sense that, you don't have to have a title, but you impact and influence people. And I wanted to hear stories from Black individuals that were sort of doing that in different ways. So that's why, hence the name Made to Lead. And the stories are similar in the sense of, they are about a leadership journey, but they're different because each person's journey is different. And the feedback that I've gotten has been insanely immense and great. Like it's beyond what I thought. I had a professor from Queen's University listen to the podcast, and as a result of that, I'm speaking on a panel at Queen's based on one of the episodes, because that's what he's teaching in his finance class, like his finance communication class, about access to venture capital for people of color and Black individuals and Indigenous folks, right? So we're going to chat about that in the session.
Wow.
But yeah, so that's kind of the stuff that has just sort of poured out as a result of this. So you have to think about, what is that impact that I want to have? If it's relationships that you want to talk about, then make sure that you're putting out good quality content about relationships, not just, hey, I just want to speak. You might as well just write a journal. That's easy. And this stuff takes time, right? Like for mine, I also had a personal brand that I wanted to, and reputation that I wanted to maintain, right? So, my trademark is my sound quality, right? In undergrad and after undergrad, like music was my thing, right? I was a bass player, produced music while I was at Telfer, having fun with that. And so I wanted to translate that into my podcast, so I wasn't going to do it haphazardly, right? I wasn't going to record on my phone. So I got all the right equipment over a couple of weeks, and of course, people, like, when people heard it, was like, oh, this is superb, and that's what keeps people coming back. So yeah, that's the podcast journey. It's pretty interesting now, and I'm now delving deeper into it. Looking at what the future holds for podcasting. The big tech players are coming into it heavily. Like Spotify has been doubling down on podcasts over the last 2.5 years, with over $500 million in acquisitions in the podcast space for podcast networks. So I'm actually building one as well with a couple of co-founders, mainly focused on taking the podcasting, growing the podcasting space on the African continent, because it's so podcasting is so low in terms of media consumption.
I feel like it must be very high radio consumption in a lot of these countries, but podcasting, with the exception of South Africa and maybe Kenya and some of the other more developed countries.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's a huge growth opportunity there. So what we want to do is create this podcast network that has these shows created by Africans, but for not just an African audience, but for a global audience as well. So when you listen to my podcast, it's I'm an African individual, but all of the concepts are applicable anywhere to anyone around the world. So that's the kind of mentality that we want to build in some of the shows that we will create or acquire into the network.
You got to get our friend Tim Chung, who I don't know if he's just hanging out, lurking on the thread still, to get you in with Serge Ibaka, exactly, or Masai, have him pull some strings there. Come on along.
How cool would that be?
Yeah, actually, that's a very good idea, because I'd love to put Masai on the podcast.
It's so funny. I was at the Shopify office in Toronto in probably January or February, not right before lockdown, and Masai was doing a talk at Shopify as part of a Toronto community event, but we were offering the venue. And I was there and ran into Tim in the lobby, and was like, "What the hell are you doing here?" And he's like, he was basically the guy, blocking and tackling for Masai as he was coming in. And so him and I are just chatting. Masai's on his, BlackBerry, probably signing new players. But he's got some clout there, that Tim.
Oh yeah, he's good. He's good. Yeah. No, I got to reach out to Tim. I haven't seen him in a minute, but we keep up on LinkedIn. So yeah, I guess that's the podcast question.
That's great.
I guess to that point, let's talk about even your portfolio, right? So you manage international markets. How, what has that been like in terms of, Shopify's massive expansion over the last, 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, it's Shopify had this really interesting paradox, which was that by design it was geographic agnostic. If there were a couple of high friction points, you had to have a credit card to pay us. That was the only way. And you had to have English language up until a couple of years ago. But if you could overcome those two hurdles, nothing stopped you from opening up a store. And so even in 2010, I remember looking at some of the early dashboards, and we had merchants in 50 different countries, because so long as you were, able to use PayPal and could comprehend English, you were fine. You could open up in Fiji for all we cared. It was on you to then hopefully have a way to put something in a box and ship it from A to B, or to put money from a person's PayPal into your bank account. But, in most countries, that's not a problem, minus maybe a handful of, state-sponsored terrorist countries. So so we were internationally by design, and it was starting to become very apparent that commerce outside of marketplaces, which was really how commerce was introduced to a lot of us. If you think back about 15 years ago, commerce was e-commerce was, PayPal and eBay, right? You buy something on eBay, and eBay said use PayPal, and PayPal would be the do I put my credit card in the website? Like that was sort of the friction you were getting over culturally, but then it became the norm. And then we were very comfortable putting credit cards into whatever website we wanted to. Yeah. And so then as a result of that, we started to see a lot of traction in countries that were following similar trends to North America. So Western Europe started to follow, developed parts of Asia started to follow, countries in individual parts of LATAM, so Mexico or say South Africa, like, started to follow those trends. And then when we decided as a company to say, let's go international, it was really a commitment to engaging in product. It was saying, we're going to make it easier to pay without a credit card. We're going to make Shopify available in 20 different languages so that you can use it entirely in Spanish or Portuguese or, in French. And part of that commitment was, and what I was responsible for, was starting to hire teams in markets that could help us get closer to the merchants in those countries who expressed frustrations, be it in our product or our service, that were prohibitive for them to be able to use it. So as an example of it is, most people that come to Shopify, as much as it's a DIY product, like they just don't want to do it themselves. They're like, I have money, like I just want to pay a guy and the guy's going to do it for me. And then like, I'll be online. Right. Well, you have to have a network of people that are willing to take money and then build a site for somebody. So like you got to build ecosystems there. In France, it's very common for people because many people live in apartments or like multi-floor dwellings that don't, unlike North America, have doormen. And so most people can't ship packages to their home because there's no one there to collect them. And so a very common piece of infrastructure in Europe is pickup points or parcel lockers, right? So you ship it to the nearest grocery store and they keep it for you, or you ship it to a locker that you get texted a PIN code and then you go use the PIN code to open the locker to get your package. And so, like we build most of the software out of Ottawa, like we don't know what a parcel locker looks like. And so how do you build that into your core product? Or cash on delivery, right? You think of a lot of cash heavy economies, much of Africa, it is basically like, okay, well, I buy something, you bring it to me, I look at it, I decide if I want to pay you cash for it, and then you take said cash and you go back. Well, like that breaks the normal flow of how you'd order something off Amazon here, which is you pay for it, you wait until the product gets to you, then you decide if you like the product, and if you don't like the product, you then have to weigh the pros and cons of refunding the product. And sometimes you just go, it's not worth it, I'm going to keep it, or I'm just going to donate it. And so those flows of commerce are so different country to country, which made us realize, like, if we're really going to tap into the mainstream of e-commerce of certain countries and compete against what people expect us to be in a certain country, we got to be close to the problem. And so that's what's been really interesting as we've ventured into corners of the globe. And so today I have teams, I have someone in Mexico, in Porto Alegre in Brazil, teams in Berlin, teams in Paris, Amsterdam, all throughout Spain and Italy, really focusing on figuring out like, what is that dimension that we've missed having been a biased North American company and what commerce means to a country.
Like, I mean, you mentioned from, having you work in multiple time zones effectively. How has that been on your mental health, dealing with multiple time zones from chair, and not being able to interact with them? How has that been for you?
Work in progress. I think I've mastered techniques, but I have not mastered the craft. And so on a technique perspective, I care far less about FOMO, I don't feel this obligation to be available 24/7, and as a result of that, I then get much better at sharing like expectations with people. Like, hey, here's when I'm going to be online. Here's how I like to communicate, So I do read emails at 2 a.m. if I happen to wake up and I'm not doing anything, but I might also see a message and just not respond. And I find a lot of people on my team, in particular younger folks, have a really hard time with that. Like that's a really stressful, I think, challenge of the current generation is like just waiting, like the patience. I don't know if you guys feel that in your respective worlds, but man, like just telling people like sit on your hands for 24 hours, like it's really, really hard to do.
It's getting tough. It's getting tough. And
totally.
I don't know if you guys have seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, but it's like, I think I watched it and I was like, yeah, I need to figure out how to wean myself off of the technology, and I think because of the pandemic, you're stuck in, there's nothing else to really do, but you're pulling to refresh every time, right? To see if there's something else interesting that can get you out of just walking around whatever size unit you have. But yeah, it's been and like for me, I started my current role completely remote, right? And the bank no one was working at the bank, and I met my entire team all remote. Never met them in person, so I don't know. Like, it was difficult the first month trying to gauge energy and rapport, right? And some people weren't comfortable putting on video, so I don't even know what some of my team looks like because they've never come on video.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's dealing with that, and I have to gauge, who's the a very deep introvert that I need to pull information out, versus how do I manage the extrovert that's the first one to be on video. So that's been the challenge, especially from a people manager, people leadership perspective. And then, of course, the learning curve, right? Sometimes, when you're in that office environment, right, you can just sit next to someone. Oh, I don't know something. You look at their screen quickly and they can teach you in 5 minutes. Now you have to set up whole 30-minute meetings,
Totally.
just to get a simple question answered. So,
well, Ellen, like, I'm curious for you as I stare ominously at the massive binder behind you on your desk, in the field of law, I mean, it's so rooted in tradition, and it's so rooted in like practices that have been literally etched in stone around like what you're supposed to do or not supposed to do, or like, no, we can't use DocuSign. The courts don't allow DocuSign. How have you, like, how is the culture in the practice of law dealt with all of this?
It was a huge shock to the system, the legal community. We don't like change, and we don't embrace technology. And a lot of lawyers just sort of panicked. But I mean, just like everything else, it's forced us to adapt and make those changes, albeit very slowly. I'm very proud of our firm. We onboarded people very quickly, and even for myself, I was already working from home pretty regularly, and I've moved into talent management now, but basically now responsible for onboarding, hundreds of people, lawyers and clerks and students. And we ran a student program this summer, entirely virtual. So it's sort of introducing the changes slowly, but everyone was sort of, somewhat forced into the new normal, and the courts and the Supreme Court and any sort of hearings and litigation and everything else, like, we've had to adjust, and it was long overdue. Like, I laugh about DocuSign because when I was practicing corporate law, our clients would want to use a program like that, and we would say, oh no, we can send a student in a taxi and we'll come to your office and you can sign the physical paper. And we were doing everything paper closing, and it did frustrate me as someone of the younger generation. Like, we have the tools to do it, but trying to get lawyers on board, and they're so, like you said, entrenched in tradition, and this is how we've always done it and it works well. It's quite challenging. So yeah, it's been very interesting. It keeps me very busy.
How are you guys looking at new technology, like disruptive technology in the legal profession? Because I know a few years back, there was this whole thing when, I think it was JP Morgan that decided to use AI to trim over 250,000 legal hours by using machine learning and a whole bunch of other technology to handle contract reviews.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think law firms were like, "Oh my God, what's going to happen here?" How has that played out in Stikeman or in any of other firms within your law, like within other law firms where you have colleagues? And what's the technology transformation looking like?
that's one of the main areas for sure, in terms of the ability to analyze a bulk of documents that much quicker, but still finding a way in which lawyers and students can be useful as part of that process to ensure that we still have an importance in the profession. And I mean, the technology obviously has its limits, but it sure has helped us in terms of efficiencies and being able to parse out those certain terms and conditions that you typically find in the contracts. And even from when I started 5-6 years ago, when we were doing it manually or literally getting boxes of documents, to having the software to analyze, hundreds of thousands of documents at one time, and then more having students go in and spot check them and go through the reports and more from a high level perspective, see what the trends are. It's been very interesting. So definitely due diligence, document review in terms of flagging documents for privilege in a litigation matter. We're looking at AI for that. Believe it or not, minute books, like when you're incorporating documents, a lot of that is still hard copy. So we're looking at technology to do that all online. And a huge part of my new role has been, how do we take recruiting and make it virtual? How do we network virtually? How do we recruit students virtually? How do we connect with schools virtually? And it's in using, Microsoft Teams and platforms like this. I'm pushing for the firm to use this platform for our networking session next month and things like that. So it's been really interesting, but again, very, very slow change.
Nice.
Yeah. Brennan, I know we only have 10 more minutes, but I actually had a question for you. And it was, again, sort of taking you back to when you were working overseas. And I'm thinking back to Telfer days when we talk about cross-cultural management and, working in different environments with different cultures. And I remember taking a Doing Business in India course with Marvin Hoff. And I'm just so curious if you could highlight some of those experiences that you had cross-culturally, or what did you find to be the biggest challenges or surprises when you were overseas with Shopify?
Oh man, like there's so many fun jumping off points for that question. What was really interesting, so there's a broader theme in the meta of all of this, which is just like empathy, right? And how man, so much of life is just about so much of the enjoyment of human interaction is around people that just have high degrees of empathy, because we're all so complex, and yet we often like to make things so simple. And so that paradox is really interesting, because it leads to a lot of, I think, what we're seeing socially as problems in this, in this country, in North America. And there's something about being dropped into a country that you just know nothing about, no people, the people don't look like you, that you don't understand the language, the food's different, the smells are different. It's just such a humbling experience if you can bask in how uncomfortable that is. And I think the net result of that is just this incredible degree of empathy around what that must feel like for anybody in any situation that you ever encounter. And I mean, that was the first time I have this my mom's Caucasian, my dad was from Singapore. And so, I'm a mixed race kid. I'm a mutt, right? And I've never necessarily had enough dominant Caucasian features to be passed as white, nor have I had necessarily enough Asian features to be considered Asian. I will go on vacation and be very easily confused for ethnicities all over the world. Right. And so in Canada and the US, in a lot of ways, I never felt like a minority, but I never really felt like the norm. And when I was in India, it was one of the first times where I was I am a visible minority. Yeah. I am not like anybody in this country. And India, in Bangalore, there's not tourists in Bangalore. It's just, it's Indians and 4 expats. And And so what was really interesting in that experience was just this incredible, humbling experience about what it's like to be so uncomfortable in so many different situations. And then how do you then translate that as an individual into, okay, like, what do I got to do to survive in this sort of situation? What do I have to do to thrive? How do I do business? How do I embrace like this new culture that I'm experiencing? And it's been so important to have that experience in my life over and over and over again, where I just feel like I approach situations so differently in where I check my biases, the perceived interpretations of what I might say or what I might do, the discipline to just lead with curiosity, and not lead with this belief that I know what's best. And I think that is like so incredibly important. And I think in Canada, ironically, given how diverse we are, I think we almost are like, I think we actually create a bit of a blind spot for ourselves in Canada. Like, I think because we're part of such a diverse country, we take for granted what it means to be unique in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is it's so easy to be like, well, yeah, I know people of all different races and religions and languages. Like, yeah, I get that. I'm from Canada, you know, and that's like, sure, true to maybe some extent, but then there's this like other end of the awareness spectrum that if you get to live in is just a complete shock to the system. And I think you have to appreciate it only really can hit you if it is a shock to the system. Yeah. So you have to shock your system. And to do that, and that's why I think it's so exciting for high school students and university students, go study abroad, right? And don't go study abroad in like the US, like go to a country that like you don't know the language. Like you have to shock your system, because those are the kinds of things that then create a more whole individual when it comes to just, life skills, but then also obviously business skills. And the business skills will serve you very, very well. But like the life skills are the things you die with.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, when you're taken out of your element, even if it's just to travel to a new place. And I visited India as well. I didn't live there, but I traveled there for a month, and like that was such a profound experience for me. I'll never forget it. And same with Japan, like just going to somewhere completely different, completely unknown, and really embracing it and stepping into it. I think that has the biggest impact on you. And like you said, how you then go back to Canada and reflect and approach new challenges and new experiences with people. I think, yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really good.
And it's 10 after 8. I think the system is going to shut us down here pretty quickly. So just, again, wanted to thank you all. And there's still a couple of stragglers, watching with their eyeballs on this. But again, Brennan and Aziz and Ellen, thanks for the fireside chat. And thanks everyone else for joining us tonight. And it's always a unique opportunity to get alumni from any institution together. And when they've got some great shared experiences and some great insight, it always just makes the conversation richer. So thanks for everyone for being a part of that.